Hi, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. And our topic for tonight is Bobby. The national debt is not an existential crisis. So, what's that about? In a recent appearance on CNN, in an interview with Aaron Burnett, Bobby Kennedy named, he made the large claim that Joe Biden and Donald Trump weren't talking about any of the existential crises facing the U.S. And then he said, such as, and he named a number of them. And one of the crises that he named was, which he called an existential crisis, was the large value of the national debt at $34 trillion. That's where this topic comes from. Bobby, the national debt is not an existential crisis. And you are flat out wrong to claim, that it is. Well, I stated that opinion in a tweet storm I did today, at least a tweet thread. And I'm going to go over that with you. Before I do, though, let me share the stream. To my feed in hopes that some people will join us. And there's Steve Wolfbrand. Hi, Steve. It's nice to see you. So I want to go over a tweet storm, or at least a tweet thread that I posted on X today. And here's the thread. Let's start out with that. There, is Aaron Burnett and Bobby, and this is the segment where he said what he said.
Each. They ran a more spending than all the previous presidents going back to George Washington combined. the chronic disease epidemic. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60% do. It's the biggest issue we have. $4.3 trillion that we're spending on that. And it's 4 times, almost 5 times our military budget. And it's getting worse and worse. You've never heard President Trump talk about it, never heard President Biden. The polarization in our country, again, existential. All of these issues, AI, and neither of them has the capacity to deal with these. And all of those issues are created by a system of corporate capture.
Okay, so I won't go through the whole of that, but the tweet in which Bobby referenced that said, neither Trump or Biden will talk about the existential issues facing our country, like the $34 trillion debt they've run up, or the 60% of Americans who suffer from chronic disease, like the threat of AI, or the capture of our government by our corporate donors. And the reason they won't speak up is that they're products of the system that created these problems in the first place. I think Americans who want real change will vote for me and not the lesser, of two evils. Well, the bone I want to pick with this is the claim that the $34 trillion debt, is an existential issue. So I quote tweeted that. And my first tweet, I said, I agree that neither Biden nor Trump will talk about existential issues facing us. But the national debt is not one of them, because neither, quote, the debt, unquote, nor the debt to GDP ratio is important for fiscal responsibility. Why is that true? And in the second tweet, I say, because the U.S. is a monetary sovereign, issuing its own currency, B, allowing that currency to float in international trade, and C, incurring debts in no other currency but our own. Its monetary sovereignty allows the U.S. to pay any debt obligation it may have as it falls due, as the debt falls due. That was the second of the tweets. Tweet number 3, if the Treasury lacks the funds to pay an obligation, either Congress or the executive branch can cause the Federal Reserve to create new reserves necessary to pay for it for the Treasury spending account. Congress can do this by passing a money bill, including the attached language, and then I attached a graphic defining overt congressional financing by using the language that would be used in order to create overt congressional financing, of the money bill in question. And as I've often said on this show, reading the small amount of text that would need to be included in any money bill, upon passage of this appropriations bill, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account at the New York Federal Reserve with the addition to its reserve balance necessary to spend this appropriation. In addition, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account with the additions to the Treasury reserve balances necessary to repay all outstanding debt instruments, including principal and interest, as they fall due for the fiscal year of this appropriation. Now, you should note that that second sentence takes care of paying back the outstanding debt instruments, including principal and interest, for the period of that appropriation. But if this text were used as boilerplate for all the money bills that went through Congress over a period of 30 years, it would eventually be the case that if no further federal debt were issued, all of the outstanding federal debt would be paid down to zero by using this boilerplate language. And there would be no need to issue any more debt in order to cover any more deficits, because the money would already be in the Treasury spending account to spend any appropriations that would produce, a deficit. So that was the third of the tweets. The fourth tweet said, it moved to the executive branch and said, the executive branch can do it by minting a high value 1 ounce platinum coin exceeding in face value the amount of the obligation, that is the debt obligation to be paid, plus the cost of producing the coin and depositing it at the New York Fed, where the Treasury can sweep the seigniorage from the coin, the seigniorage, into its spending account. What is the seigniorage? It's the difference between the face value of the coin and the cost of producing it and depositing it at the New York Fed. So, what would be the seigniorage if a $100 trillion coin were deposited, at the New York Fed? Roughly speaking, the seigniorage would be the cost of the coin, of course, to produce it. That might be roughly, let's say $3,000. And then to transport the coin up to New York and deposit it might be another $500. Maybe I'm underestimating it, because maybe you want to, get an armored car and guards and do that. Maybe it would cost $5,000 or $6,000. So the seigniorage would be $100 trillion minus $5,000 or $6,000. In other words, almost $100 trillion seigniorage, $100 million in seigniorage being swept into the Treasury spending account. Of course, it couldn't all be spent, because it would not all have been appropriated by the Congress. The appropriation provides the authority to spend whatever money lies in the Treasury spending account. So, tweet number 5. It is important to note here that the Secretary of the Treasury can specify the value of the platinum coin at his discretion. In previous discussions, the coins of various values have been discussed. If a 100T coin were created, $100 trillion coin, and the amount of seigniorage, and here we move on to the 6th tweet, created, would fund full repayment of the national debt of 34.6T plus interest, and would also fund deficit spending for many years to fund. Considering the availability of overt congressional financing, that's OCF, and platinum coin methods, it's plain that the debt is not one of the U.S.'s existential crises. These certainly include, this is number 7, the risk of nuclear war and the climate emergency, in addition to the ones other than the debt that were mentioned by Bobby. Indeed, to meet these crises, a new Kennedy administration will need additional policy space to deficit spend provided by overt congressional financing and platinum coins. Then, technical details that using the platinum coin seigniorage, as well as discussion of legal, economic, political issues and policies related to it, are discussed in this ebook from Amazon. Of course, the ebook is Fixing the Debt Without Breaking America, Austerity, the $1 trillion Coin, and Ending Debt Ceiling, Sequester, and Budgetary Crises. And the author of that book is yours truly. Then I say in the 9th tweet, finally, in my view, a big weakness in Mr. Kennedy's campaign is an evident lack of knowledge of modern monetary theory. That lack of knowledge led him to claim the national debt is one of our existential crises when it plainly is not. And if not remedied, moving on to tweet number 10, it would lead his administration into unnecessary debates, efforts, and constraints relating to finding pay-fors for policies he wants to legislate. Anyway, I think Bobby has been talking to the wrong economists and suggests he phone an old Kennedy friend, Jamie Galbraith, excuse me, as well as, moving to the 11th and last tweet, Warren B. Mosler, Professors L. Randall Ray and Pavlina Cherneva of Bard College, and of course, Professor Stephanie Kelton of Stony Brook University, the author of the best-selling The Deficit Myth. And then I cite that from Amazon. So that is my proof that Bobby was wrong and that the national debt is not an existential crisis. The only thing that makes it any kind of crisis, at all, has nothing to do with the fiscal sustainability of the federal government. It has to do with political issues and with the beliefs of our congresspeople, and the beliefs of our presidents, who also are largely ignorant, of MMT, don't know anything about overt congressional financing, and very few evidently know anything about the platinum coin and its possible use. So, what I wanted to spend the rest of my time doing tonight is to make sure that anybody who watches this understands the fiscal responsibility narrative that I want to talk about right now. So this is an excerpt from a longer presentation called Back to Basics, MMT Back to Basics. And this is an excerpt on an MMT fiscal responsibility narrative. And I just produced this presentation taken from other slides, today. So let's get this up there. So the first slide in this MMT fiscal responsibility narrative is fiscal sustainability. What is that? Well, that's really the issue Kennedy is bringing up. Why is there a debt crisis? Because people say if the debt gets too much larger, we're not going to be able to pay it back, and we're not going to be able to keep spending because we're going to have austerity to get surpluses so that we can pay back the national debt. So, put briefly, fiscal sustainability is the capability of a government to keep on spending without reducing its capability to spend. Because, as I just said, the United States is a monetary sovereign, it can always repay any size, of debt. So however high your debt is, it doesn't reduce your capability to spend if you're a monetary sovereign like the United States. And the second bullet point here is for a fiat sovereign government like the United States, whose capability to issue currency Fed reserves, paper currency, and coins is constitutionally unlimited, and one whose fiscal but legislation places no self-constraints on this ability, has made its currency non-convertible to any other commodity or currency, has no debts in foreign currencies, and four, allows the price of its own currency to float in trading. There is literally no fiscal sustainability issue because its capability to keep on spending can never be diminished. On the second slide, real fiscal responsibility is a pattern of fiscal policy intended to achieve public purposes such as full employment, price stability, first-class educational system, also Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, and so on, while also maintaining or increasing fiscal sustainability, viewed as the extent to which patterns of government spending do not undermine the capability of the government to continue to spend to achieve its public purposes. Real fiscally responsible policy, if it works generally as expected, creates greater real benefits for the public than real costs for people. It has nothing to do with conforming to some standard simple financial measure like an acceptable quote unquote debt to GDP ratio that has only a questionable theoretical connection to the actual well-being of people. Here's more on real fiscal responsibility. It is political, fiscal, and economic malpractice to give greater priority to that kind of abstraction than to full employment, price stability, a strong social safety net, and government programs that will help us solve the many outstanding problems of our nation. Let's put an end to the domination of Washington by that kind of malpractice. Let's put an end to proposals like the misguided, fiscally irresponsible campaign to promote a, quote, grand bargain, unquote, that is sure to do nothing but destroy more private sector money and jobs than would be the case if we either did nothing or increased the deficit and created a full employment budget. And now we introduce the idea of austerity. Austerity requiring budget surpluses. Why is that austerity? For the simple reason that when you require a budget surplus, you're taking money out of the private sector. The budget surplus is there because you've taxed more as the government than you spent. That means money is taken out of the private sector through the surpluses. That's what surpluses mean. Surplus is defined as tax revenue exceeding spending, destroy net financial assets in the private sector. Never forget that lesson. Surpluses, defined as tax revenue exceeding spending, destroys net financial assets in the private sector. Unless these financial assets are replaced through revenues acquired by running a trade surplus, the continuous loss of financial assets by the private sector is unsustainable, eventually leading to credit bubbles, recession, or depression, and the return of deficit spending. It is mathematically impossible for the United States to simultaneously run a government surplus, have a trade deficit, and increase aggregate non-government sector financial wealth. The point being, if the government runs a surplus in its relations with the non-government, That means that the non-government is losing money to the government. It's paying out to the government more than it's getting from the government. What about deficit reduction plans? It is fiscally irresponsible to frame and follow a long-term deficit reduction plan. This is also known as a limited austerity plan, when both a trade deficit and an output gap exists. What is an output gap? It's when the output produced by the private sector is less than its potential because the deficit is being reduced. Why? Because such a plan is one that must remove more money from the economy that would otherwise be the case every year the deficit reduction plan is pursued. And eventually, if pursued for long enough, a declining rate of addition to net financial assets would exacerbate the output gap by lowering aggregate demand and causing both labor and capital to deteriorate, thus reducing the productive capacity of the economy and the government's ability to sustain greater levels of deficit spending, producing outputs of real social value without triggering inflation. Next, we get to Social Security and Medicare. Social Security has no solvency or, running out of money problems. The Social Security crisis is a phony one. No solution to this, fiscal crisis, bipartisan or partisan, is needed. What is needed is a solution to the political problem of getting Social Security's funding guaranteed in perpetuity by Congress, just the way it guarantees funding for Medicare Parts B and D right now. The same applies to the so-called Medicare crisis. It too is phony and can be solved easily by Congress guaranteeing funding in perpetuity to Medicare Parts A and C. More generally, there is no entitlement funding crisis in the United States, except a political crisis where U.S. politicians are determined to ignore their constituents and cut back on an already inadequate safety net, either because they believe in or want others to believe in false ideas about fiscal responsibility and the government. And next, we have the objection, will be Greece or Ireland. Well, Greece and Ireland are users of the euro, not issuers of it, as we are of the dollar. So their supply is always limited, and that's why they can run out of euros. However, the U.S. is the issue of the U.S. dollar, so its supply of dollars is limited only by its desire to create them and its ability to mark up private accounts. That's why it can't become Greece, Ireland, or any other Eurozone nation. In addition to taxing and borrowing, the government, including the combined activities of the Congress, the Treasury, and the Federal Reserve, has an unlimited capacity to create it. The government of the United States, I should say this chart is about Treasury bonds are like saving accounts. The government of the United States offers the functional equivalent of interest-bearing savings accounts to investors, usually wealthy individuals, large corporations, and foreign nations. The savings accounts are usually called U.S. Treasury securities, and the sum of their face values, that is, the face values of the outstanding U.S. Treasury securities that have not yet been redeemed, is called the debt subject to the limit, or more colloquially, the national debt. Even though comparable savings accounts in banks are for some reason not called bank debt, even though they are, from an accounting perspective, but liabilities. The Treasury can keep accepting deposits, borrowing money, and issuing securities. Okay, if we wanted to. Let me get back to that previous slide. I missed something at the end of it. A case, this is a case, oh, sorry. I guess I slipped the whole side. Yeah, I stopped that. The Treasury can keep accepting deposits, that is borrowing money, and issuing securities, okay, if it wants to. There's no limit on this government credit card, just as there's no limit, okay, to the deposits a bank can accept, except the one imposed arbitrarily by Congress in the form of the amount of the debt subject to the limit, otherwise known as the debt ceiling. So if the U.S. does run out of money due to a failure to raise the debt ceiling, it will clearly be the fault of the Congress for refusing to grant further authority to the Treasury. Okay, not only that, it will clearly be the fault of the Congress for refusing to grant further authority to the Treasury to elicit and accept further deposits, and that is also known as refusing to raise the debt ceiling. So note here that the Congress can raise the debt ceiling anytime it wants. It can remove the debt ceiling from legislation entirely, just not have a debt ceiling. Okay, if that happens, of course, then there would be none of this talk about a possible default or the federal government actually running out of money. But if it were to run out of money due to a failure to raise the debt ceiling, it would also be the fault of the Treasury for refusal to use its power to mint 1-ounce platinum coins, whose face value may be set by the Secretary of the Treasury. If any of these things happen, that is a case of fiscal irresponsibility, not a fiscal unsustainability. In other words, there'd be nothing wrong with the Fed if that happened. It would be wrong of the people who would think that their failure to raise money to give to the Federal Reserve Bank is a case of fiscal unsustainability when it's really a case of fiscal irresponsibility. What is lacking is the will to actually raise the debt ceiling, or the will to refuse to mint 1-ounce platinum coins, or the will to refuse to use overt congressional financing to fund federal spending. There's no limit by foreign nations either. Even though it may seem that foreign nations can place a limit on, quote, the national credit card, unquote, by refusing to buy Treasury securities, foreign nations holding dollars basically have a choice between continuing to hold them and earning no income or earning interest on them by buying securities. Even though it may seem that foreign nations can place a limit on the national credit card, unquote, by refusing to buy Treasury securities, foreign nations holding dollars basically have a choice between continuing to hold them and earning no income or earning interest on them by buying securities. So long as other nations are exporting to the United States and accepting dollars as payment, those dollars are likely to be invested in the interest bearing savings accounts known as Treasury securities. Bond markets don't control U.S. interest rates. The Federal Reserve Bank does by exercising its authority to meet its target interest rates. The bond vigilantes have no power against the Fed. If they fight against its interest rate targets by trying to bid them up, then they will, quote, die, unquote, in the flood of reserves the Fed can unleash to drive the interest rates down to their chosen target. Of course, in recent history, the Fed has not had to do that. It maintains its interest rates actually fairly easily. Next, the U.S. must pay its debts. Often people do not realize that. But from a legal point of view, the U.S. is obligated by Section 4 of the 14th Amendment to pay all its debts as they come due. Nevertheless, our national debt cannot be a burden on our grandchildren unless they wish to make it so by stupidly taxing more than they spend. This is true because assuming the debt ceiling is raised when needed or repealed, we have an unlimited credit card to incur new debt at interest rates of our choosing. It's too bad that Bobby Kennedy doesn't understand that. So we can, quote, roll over, unquote, our national debt indefinitely, or alternatively, we can create all the money we need to pay off the debt subject to the limit without ever incurring any more debt. So here is that slide I showed you before on creating overt congressional financing. I'm not going to read it again because I read it before and I think I explained it, so presumably you understood it. So more on the MMT fiscal responsibility narrative. Specifically, the U.S. can always create new money. One way to do this is through platinum coin seigniorage. The second way is through Congress ordering the Fed to use its ability to create money out of thin air to add reserves to the Treasury spending account, equal to the amount of its appropriations plus the amount of principal plus interest on federal debt falling due during the period of the appropriation. I call this the second way, overt congressional financing. A third way, to create money is through subordinating the Fed to the Treasury Department and then having Treasury order the Fed to create all the reserves necessary to spend appropriations and pay back debt. The first way is legal now. The second way is constitutional but requires action.
Sure. Just waking.
I'm sorry.
I was waking you.
Oh, thank you. Uh, so, the first way is legal now. The second is constitutional but requires action by Congress. The third is constitutional but would require politically unlikely actions of Congress to authorize it. So, on to slide 15. In this MMT fiscal responsibility narrative, it isn't about the deficits. It isn't about the debts. It's about the public purpose. A fiscal policy that measures its success or failure in reducing deficits rather than by its impacts on public purpose is fiscally irresponsible and politically unsustainable. The deficit is a meaningless measure from the viewpoint of government solvency because the U.S. government has no limits on its authority to create/spend money other than self-imposed ones. So neither the level of the national debt nor the level of the debt to GDP ratio can affect the government's capacity to spend congressional appropriations at all. Also, a deficit debt-oriented fiscal policy ignores real outcomes relating to employment, price stability, economic growth, environmental impact, crime rates, civil strife and violence, etc., which actually can affect fiscal sustainability by strengthening or weakening the underlying economy and with it, the legitimacy of the government and its fiat currency. In short, responsible fiscal policy is not about its impact on government debt. It's about the real outcomes of that fiscal policy, the outcomes on the economic and the political and the social system themselves. In short, fiscal policy is not about its impact on government debt. It's about its impact, on people. Also, government is not like your household. The government is not like a household. Households can't make their own currency and require that people use that currency to pay taxes. So their supply of dollars, households, is always limited, while the government's supply is a matter of its decisions alone. However large the federal debt becomes, it cannot be a, quote, crushing burden, unquote, on our government, because federal spending is virtually costless to the government if the government wants it to be. Current claims that we have a fiscal crisis, that we must debate the debt, that we must fix the debt, and must immediately embark on a long-term deficit reduction program to bring the debt to GDP ratio under control, all misconceive the fiscal situation and smack of a campaign to create public hysteria. And this is the second slide on government is not like your household. They are based on the idea that fiscal responsibility is about developing a plan to bring the debt to GDP ratio, quote, under control, unquote, when it is really about using government spending to achieve outputs that fulfill, quote, public purpose, unquote. There is no fiscal crisis that will require, quote, a grand bargain, unquote, including cuts to popular discretionary spending and entitlement programs. It is a phony crisis, so the next time we get to a debt ceiling crisis, you all need to remember that it's a phony crisis. The only real crises we face are one of a failing, stagnant economy with growing economic inequality, in which only the needs of the few are served while the needs of the many are ignored, and also one of lack of political desire or will to solve these problems. MMT-based policies can help to bring an end to the first economic crisis, but not if progressives and others continue to believe in false ideas about fiscal sustainability and responsibility and the similarity of their government to a household. And there we come back to Bobby Kennedy once again. Let me pull this down because there's no need to go over these final two slides. The way we come back to Bobby Kennedy again is because Bobby Kennedy is embracing the myth that government can only spend by taxing or by borrowing. He's embracing the Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan myth that there is no such thing, as government money. There is only private money that can be taxed, or can be borrowed. If he is to realize his problem, he must change his views on how government is funded. He must change his views on how the money that government spends is created for it. It doesn't come from any money held by the private sector. All of the major expenditures of the federal government are funded by congressional appropriations and by the Federal Reserve creating new money. There is no such thing as taxpayer money being spent on federal programs. At the state level, taxpayer money is being spent. At the local level, taxpayer money is being spent or borrowed by local governments or state governments. But at the federal level, the money that is spent is created anew by the Federal Reserve every time there is a need for that money. So I will go to your comments now. Question by Robert Copeland. How many people running for president of the United States support MMT? I wouldn't ask the question of how many of them support MMT. I think the more appropriate question is how many of them know about MMT and accept its findings. I have some reason to believe that Jill Stein has become conversant with some aspects, of MMT, and is likely to learn a lot more about it and to use the MMT approach in planning our policies. I don't get the same reason, I don't get the same kind of feeling in relation to Cornel West that he may have that kind of understanding. I may be wrong about that. I'm not close to either of those candidates. Okay. I don't think that Claudia de la Cruz is much acquainted with MMT either, but I may be mistaken about her. It may be the case that Joe Biden has a glimmer, but of course, he sometimes spends money as if he's aware of what MMT has to say. But then he reverts to type and he starts talking about the need to lower deficits and to be fiscally responsible. Also, Donald Trump, even though he once said, and said accurately, that the federal government can create its own money, he's been tamed by the Republicans, who evidently ask him not to say that, and who want to go right on with their austerity budgeting, claiming the federal government does not have any money. Many Democrats still believe that the only sources of federal money are taxing, and also borrowing. There are many more who now have a glimmering of MMT, and some few of them may even have substantial understanding. For example, Rashida Tlaib. But I think those with a substantial understanding are few. Those with a glimmer are many more. But those who are thoroughly ignorant may still be 2/3 of the Congress. Even though Stephanie Skelton's book, is a bestseller in the economic category, Steve Wolfbrand says, what if the coin got lost in the sofa cushions? It would never see any sofa cushions, of course. Steve says, to each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. Karl Marx. Yes, that is a quote from Karl Marx. But I haven't seen that in any of the MMT literature. Kay says hi all. Bob says hi Kay. Okay, Robert says hi Kay. Kay says hi Robert. So, I don't want to leave you with the impression that the only thing that Bobby Kennedy has to change is to add to his knowledge, of MMT. I want to remind you of what I said before. If I can find it again. In my view, he has to change his position on that, on federal debts, deficits, fiscal responsibility, and federal spending. But he also has to change his position on the filibuster, on Medicare for all. And now that he has Nicole Shanahan in his campaign, he has to no longer take big money from contributors. I also want him to change his position on Israel-Palestine, on the climate emergency, and on neutering the Supreme Court. That he seems to have no desire to do. So I'm not, endorsing Robert Kennedy. I'm criticizing him and asking him to change his positions. And so that's where I stand. And I think that's going to be all for tonight. Some of you may have noticed I had a little problem of nodding off in that stream. I think it was just because I had a very busy day and I did not get to take a nap, which I usually do before my streams. So that's the way it is. I hope the stream wasn't too bad as a result of that. Okay, I hope you like it and you understood it. If not, I'll do it again some other time and try it once more because it's really important. But in the meantime, thank you for coming. And I think I'm going to stop here. And I believe, let's see, does Dee have a stream tonight? I don't know. I haven't checked yet, but I will now. And let you know. Yes, I believe she does. On that program, we're going to discuss how battle continues to save historic Christian Armenian quarter in Jerusalem. Where are Western Christians? Let's talk. Don't know exactly what that's about, but I'm going to go over there and find out. And I recommend that you do too. I may be a few minutes until I get there, though. So for now, I will say good night. And I'll probably see you on Dee's Saturday night show. But then not again until Tuesday night, okay, on my own show. I do know that on Tuesday night, I have a conflict with the Medicare for All event, okay, occurring then. So I may postpone my show on Tuesday night, okay, until later in the week. Or I may cover the Medicare for All event if I can find a way to do it. So everybody take care. As Steve Wolfbrand says, don't let the bed bugs bite. And if I don't see you again on the weekend, have a great one.